Next, let's look at the corroboration from Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He lived around 37 to 100 AD, and very interesting guy, he fought as a Jewish general against the Romans in Galilee in 67 AD. He was a Pharisee. Then he surrendered to the Romans and became a translator to the Roman general Titus Vespasian when he conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD. He was given Roman citizenship and lived in Rome and wrote a book about the Jewish wars of the first century, and then a series of history volumes called Antiquities of the Jews, which covered basically all of Jewish history. Josephus mentions Jesus of Nazareth twice in his history, along with mentioning several other people named Jesus. And he also mentions John the Baptist, Jesus' brother James, the Herodian kings, Pontius Pilate, and other history confirming the New Testament. Josephus confirms much of what the New Testament said about John the Baptist, that he was a righteous man who taught and baptized disciples, confirms how Herod executed him. Now this section from Antiquities 18 is very famous. It's called the Testimonium. It's considered by most scholars to have been modified in these marked places by a later Christian scribe, because Josephus sounds like a Christian here. We know he was not a Christian. He did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Here it says, Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of some such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many of the Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. It's very unlikely, based on his other writing, that Josephus would say that Jesus was the Messiah. Also, early Christian scholars in the first 200 years after Josephus, such as Origen, did not cite this passage, even though they cited other passages from Josephus many times. And if Josephus had written these things about Jesus, the early Christian writers would likely have cited them. Origen specifically says that Josephus did not accept Jesus as Christ. So some scholars, like Richard Carrier, consider this entire passage to be a forgery. But many scholars consider that Josephus did say something about Jesus in this passage, because in a later passage, Antiquities 20, he mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, and his typical pattern will be to first explain such historical people before alluding to them later in his history. Also, there are some passages that seem unlikely that a later Christian scribe would insert, such as calling Jesus simply a wise man, because Josephus previously called Solomon or Daniel that term, or that Jesus performed surprising feats or surprising works, which is a phrase that Josephus previously used about Elisha from the Old Testament. Also, no other Christian writers use the word tribe to describe Christians, but Josephus did use that term for various groups, not just ethnically related, but other groups as well. Also, the comment that many of the Gentiles had followed Jesus during his life does not fit what the Gospels say, that Jesus' ministry was mostly limited to Jews during his lifetime. So some scholars suggest that Josephus' original text was more neutral toward Jesus, simply removing those inserted phrases. Other scholars suggest that the original may have been more negative. Here's a suggestion by F.F. Bruce about what a more negative version of Josephus' original text may have looked like, based on the context, which had been listing various sources of trouble before this passage. So this would be saying, now there arose at this time a source of further trouble, and so on. Other scholars suggest that simply removing those suspicious phrases is more likely, and say that Josephus' original text was more neutral, like this version. And you can see there's basically the text that we have in Josephus today without those insertions. There's actually an Arabic version of Josephus from Agapius in the 10th century and a Syriac version from Michael the Syrian in the 12th century, which actually match this neutral version pretty well, and they're similarly missing those extra phrases about Jesus being the Christ and rising from the dead. But over the past 13 years, scholars have debated whether that Arabic is older than Eusebius' text of the current Greek version we have today, or whether the Arabic and Arabic and Syriac versions were paraphrasing from Eusebius' work from 324 AD. But most scholars currently agree that Josephus said something to one of these similar to one of these original versions in his original text. In other words, it's either this more negative version or this more neutral version, but it almost certainly did not say that he was the Christ and that he rose from the dead. So in summary, Josephus, the most famous Jewish historian of the day, who had lived through the Jewish wars in the 60s, corroborated the New Testament about John the Baptist, Jesus' brother James, and also likely corroborated the basic history about Jesus regarding his being a miracle worker, or being known as a miracle worker, let's say, his crucifixion under Pilate, and the continuation of the group of followers after his death. Another Roman historian who briefly corroborated the New Testament was Suetonius. He lived from about 70 to 122 AD, and he was a friend of Pliny the Younger. He became director of imperial archives under Emperor Trajan, and later became Emperor Hadrian's personal secretary. He wrote more than 20 books, of which most were lost. One of his surviving books was the Lives of the 12 Caesars, a set of 12 biographies published around 120 AD. In the biography of Emperor Claudius, he says this about Claudius: "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from Rome." So this corroborates the brief note in Acts that Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And that is how Paul later met Aquila and Priscilla, who became his good friends, and so on. Some scholars believe that Suetonius may have been referring to Jesus the Christ by his mention of Christus. The Greek name Christus was very common among slaves, and it meant useful, but the Greek word Christos was very uncommon as a name in Rome. The Greek word means anointed, like we talk about the christening of a ship. So if the Jews in Rome were like the Jews in Thessalonica and other cities Paul visited, they may have been causing riots and persecuting the Jewish followers of Jesus, and the police reports after these riots may have written down Christus as the name of the riot, mishearing the word Christos, that is the anointed one or Messiah. And 70 years later, Suetonius cited the reports that he found in his research in the library. Nevertheless, regardless of what he meant by Christus, this mention of Claudius's expulsion of the Jews is another confirmation of Luke's accuracy in Acts 18. Here are a couple more non-Christian historical corroborating sources. A historian named Thallus was cited by Christian philosopher Julius Africanus in 220 AD. Thallus talked about the strange darkness that happened at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, and he tried to explain it as a solar eclipse. But Africanus correctly said this was not possible because it happened at the time of Passover, which would be full moon, so the moon would not be in a position to cause an eclipse. We do not have any manuscripts or long excerpts surviving from Thallus' writings, but he's listed with other historians such as Polybius and Castor of Rhodes, so he was apparently a solid historian. And Africanus himself was highly educated and a careful researcher and writer who wrote several works and helped Emperor Severus to build the library at the Pantheon in Rome. So this reference to Thallus is somewhat reliable. Also, another Christian author, Tertullian, wrote in 197 AD that the Romans had a record of this darkness in their archives. So this is another confirmation that this strange darkness mentioned in the Gospels did actually happen, and the New Testament said it did. Another Roman source is a letter from Pliny the Younger to Emperor Trajan around 113 AD. Pliny was governor of Bithynia and Pontus, in the north of modern-day Turkey. He asked Trajan for advice on how to prosecute people who were anonymously accused of being Christians. This is helpful to see what Christians at that later time believed, and just to understand the persecution they lived under. But since the date is 80 years after Jesus, it's not as useful in terms of historical corroboration as some of the others like Tacitus and Josephus. But it talks about what the Christians believed. They met together on the first day of the week. They sang hymns to Christ as God and different things that they believed 80 years later. Another one, the Babylonian Talmud, so getting into the Jewish rabbinic traditions. It does have a couple references to Jesus, all negative, according to the scholars who have looked into this, saying, for example, that he practiced sorcery and led the people astray. This account in Sanhedrin 43a mentions that he was hanged rather than stoned, which is interesting. It corroborates, again, his death. This term hanged could also refer to his being crucified, so he was not stoned as the Jews would typically seek to execute people. There are some important differences here to the Gospels, and now this wasn't written down until perhaps the 4th century, so there's not a lot of helpful eyewitness testimony here. But it's interesting that the Jewish response of Jesus was not to claim that he never existed or that he did not do miracles, but instead, exactly as the Gospels record, the rabbis considered Jesus to be teaching idolatry because he claimed himself to be divine, and they considered his miracles to be done with sorcery, not that he didn't do any miracles. So this is a corroboration of those facts. So we've seen that there are many external corroborations the Gospels and Acts are telling accurate history, where we can check them against archaeology and non-Christian authors. And you can check the supplement for many more details.